while the ceasefire was being negotiated in Moscow a couple of days ago, the Turkish defense minister was in Italy. And they told him that, it looks like they're on the verge of a ceasefire. And he said there will only be a ceasefire when the Armenians leave Nagorno-Karabakh.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to bring you potentially our most important interview we've ever done. On September 27, the Azerbaijani army, backed by the Turkish military, launched an attack against the region of Artsakh. And under the global context of a pandemic and a US election cycle, nobody has really been able to hear about it and to discuss it. So today I'm here at the office of the Armenian National Committee of Australia. I've got Joel Jammal co-hosting. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
And we've got two experts who are here to break down the topic with us. First of all, Hayk Kayserian, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
The Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of Australia. And secondly, Kaylar Michaelian, or Michaelian.
Correct.
These Armenian names are going to give me some trouble, and it's potentially going to happen throughout the interview, who is the permanent representative of the President of the Armenian region of Artsakh in Australia. I don't think there's anybody better in Australia we could get to discuss the issue, so thank you both for coming on.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Now, since September 27, according to recent estimates, 50% of the population of Artsakh has been displaced. There's been at least 500 deaths. Could you briefly give an introduction to what's actually been going on for people who are not familiar?
Okay. Hayk, I'll go with... so as you said, Dougal, rightly, on 27th of September, early in the morning at 7 o'clock, around 7 o'clock, the Azerbaijani armed forces, backed by Turkish military personnel, physically present on site, but also something that is even more insidious, with about 4,000 jihadist terrorists, attacked the entire line of contact between Artsakh and Azerbaijan. These, in particular, I just want to concentrate for a moment on these terrorists being there. These terrorists are the jihadist terrorists who have wreaked havoc in Syria, in Libya, and in the Middle East generally. They're remnants of ISIS. They were recruited by the Turkish government, paid for and transported directly to Azerbaijan a few weeks ahead of this planned attack on Artsakh. So on the 27th, the entire line of contact was attacked. The Armenian forces, the Artsakh Defense Forces, were able to initially be able to hold off these attacks, and to their credit have done so to this day. Despite Azerbaijan having spent well over $2 billion and more per year in arming themselves over the past 20 years. They're using all sorts of weaponry. They're using all sorts of missiles purchased over the years from Belarus, from Russia, United States even, and also from drones and weaponry from Israel, which they've imported recently into Azerbaijan. So basically it is an army of well over 100,000 against an army of just around about 20,000.
Well, they have a population in Artsakh only of 150,000.
Correct. There was an interesting question asked by a journalist last year from the former president of Artsakh, Bako Saakyan. They asked him, what's the number of the armed forces in Artsakh? And he said 150,000, because everyone in Artsakh is a soldier determined to defend their home and their homeland. So since the attack, as you rightly said, indiscriminate shelling of civilian population areas have been undertaken by the Azeri army, by the Turkish Air Force, who has been actively involved. and the jihadists themselves. The continued attacks on the civilian population has deliberately targeted hospitals, churches, schools, kindergartens, and the population in general has been, in an orderly fashion, moved away from the danger areas, the civilian population, as much as possible. Some of the population have remained behind, the sick and the elderly mainly, and we've recently heard of atrocities committed by the Turks, by the Azeris, and in particular by the jihadists. We recall the days when they were beheading prisoners or hostages in Syria. That at the moment is the method of executing Armenians in Artsakh, in the areas that they have been able, in small villages that they have been able to infiltrate. That's the current situation, a very sad and dire situation, but also to the credit of our armed forces, despite the total imbalance of forces and weaponry, etc. 18 days now, is that correct? Yeah. So for the past 18 days, our small defense army has been able to withstand this wave upon wave of attacks, and to their credit have held the lines to this day.
Mm. Well, I think it's a very impressive story, and I want to ask a little bit about the connection between Armenia and Artsakh, and let's discuss, say, the disagreement territorially with Azerbaijan. Now, my understanding is that Artsakh was given to Azerbaijan by Stalin when he was Commissar of Minorities in about 1920. My Armenian friends are telling me that was illegal, and Artsakh should have kind of been part of Armenia, and that Armenia is currently sticking up for Artsakh either as a potentially independent state or potentially as integrated with Armenia in the future, given its, let's say, ethnic and culturally it's the same, more or less. Now, Hayk, what do you see as Armenia's direct relationship with Artsakh as compared to Azerbaijan's?
Well, one is a native reality, and one is a manufactured reality. The relationship between Armenia and Artsakh is one of a homeowner and their home. The relationship between Azerbaijan and Artsakh is the relationship between an invader and somebody else's home. And the reason I say that is because even by Azerbaijani records, who, by the way, as a country have been around since 1918, at its worst, at its lowest, the Armenian population of that region, of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh as they call it, was at 75%. So at its lowest, in the last thousands of years, it was populated 75% by Armenians. At its highest, 95%. Now, continuous inhabitation of a piece of land means you are indigenous to that land, and anybody else that has claims on it, it's going to be illegitimate claims. Now, in Azerbaijan's claims, you're very right, Dougal. Stalin drew some borders. He did that often during the Soviet Union. That's why it wasn't a very nice place, and history doesn't look at Stalin very nicely. But we do have these Western leaders for some reason, and leaders all around the world, that prefer to protect the borders drawn by Stalin as opposed to the rights to self-determination of indigenous peoples. So that's the difference in the relationship between the land. Now, the relationship was escalated when the Soviet Union was crumbling, which was a great time for the world. And everybody within the Soviet Union realized that their pathway to independence was becoming clearer. They would hold referendums, and the population of their regions, their their Soviet republic, so to speak, would either decide to be independent or be part of the new Russian republic, right, Russian state. Now, the Artsakh people at that time, who was still the vast majority of the population were Armenian, said, hang on a sec, yes, Stalin gave us to your Soviet control once upon a time. We've never been under your sovereign control. That's never happened. That Artsakh has been under the control of a sovereign Azerbaijan. So we will not become part of a sovereign Azerbaijan because of this decision by Stalin back then. We want to be part of Armenia. Now, as soon as Azerbaijan heard this, that sort of Ottoman inside them kicked in, and they started massacring Armenians. It was ethnic cleansing 101. There were 3 or 4 major massacres, but the Armenian people of Artsakh, which Kaylar referred to before in terms of their heroism, it became legendary during this time because what they said was, hang on a sec, we've seen this movie before. We've seen our ancestors during the Armenian genocide. These massacres, these deportations is how it starts, and where it ends is tragic. We lose a homeland, we lose an identity, we lose a culture, etc., etc. So they fought back, and it was man, woman, and child, no joke, that lifted their arms, that people from the diaspora that went and volunteered there, people from Armenia that jumped across and said, we're not going to lose this piece of dirt because this piece of dirt is home. And they fought and they won. So not only did they want to be part of Armenia and that was unacceptable to the Azerbaijanis, Azerbaijanis declared war and they lost. So regardless of the game, the winner is the Armenians. So what happened during this war is there was the vote for independence, which Artsakh conducted in the same way that every other Soviet republic was conducting, and they voted, the voting numbers I think were 83% actually voted in the referendum, and the vote was 99% in favour of independence. So they voted for independence, they've won the war. 94, Azerbaijan surrenders to a ceasefire, and Russia brokers a deal that basically says, you guys ceasefire, we'll decide this process through a coordinated process, and that process is called the OSCE Minsk process, which I'm sure we'll allude to.
Interestingly, on that OSCE or the Minsk process, Azerbaijan has been campaigning for Turkey to be a co-chair, and we've also seen Russia broker a ceasefire about 5 or 6 days ago, which hasn't seemed to be too effective. What are your hopes in the short term of peace or settlement of this conflict?
At the moment, it really looks very, very far from any resolution. The reason is a very simple one. Aliyev and Erdogan,
Aliyev being the leader of
the president of Azerbaijan, the dictator of Azerbaijan, and Erdogan, the dictator of Turkey. Their approach is a maximalist approach, all or nothing. So we will take all, and the Armenians can have nothing. With that kind of an approach, I cannot see anything moving forward in terms of any negotiations happening. Negotiations can't happen when, again, I stress, where civilian population is being bombarded on a daily basis. The capital of Stepanakert, a beautiful, beautiful city, has been virtually turned to rubble. So under those circumstances, there's very little that I can see coming from the Azeris and the Turks. From the international community, I personally, I'm not holding much hope there either. As Hayk very rightly said, the US is currently involved or self-obsessed with their elections, and the European Union, unfortunately, seems to be unable to understand and appreciate that Turkey is really out there to get their influence right across that area and from there into Europe as well.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
I think that's a really interesting point about, let's call it the relative silence of the international community. I mean, doing some of the research beforehand, I think Scott Morrison in 2011 said we need to recognise, for example, the Armenian genocide, but then since being Prime Minister, he hasn't touched on the Armenian genocide, but promotes a kind of strong relationship with Turkey. And I guess on this specific conflict, the hesitancy to either condemn Turkey or Azerbaijan would be in the hope of not offending Turkey, who seems to be, in a lot of people's mind, a strategic partner in NATO, who seems to be one of the Middle Eastern countries, I believe, who has somewhat better than average relationship with Israel. And there's whispers of, their utility in facilitating gas pipelines through to Europe and Israel and other places. Now, I'd be interested to hear your guys' perspective. Why is it that we don't see more international community, either condemnation or support? I mean, we heard Mike Pompeo. It would have been it's October 15th, but probably this morning our time, come out and condemn Azerbaijan and Turkey and said he hopes that Armenia and Artsakh can defend itself. But we haven't seen any proper intervention, and Trump has run as, let's say, an anti-interventionist candidate. We have an Armenian premier in Gladys Berejiklian, who I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. What do you think is either stopping the international dialogue on this issue, or the international condemnation, or international stances? Do you think it's to do with strategic positions? Do you think why do you think we're in that position currently?
So obviously there's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to thinking about why people are doing what they're doing. We just know through history that every country is there to serve themselves. Ultimately, America first is not a slogan that Trump came up with. This is something that it's been America first forever. It's just different people interpret it in different ways. And it's the same with Australia, it's the same with everybody else. However, there have been times in history that the greater good has taken the forefront for humanity. And of course, that's what we want when it comes to Armenia. The reason we harp on the genocide is really because it keeps happening. It literally keeps happening. And let's just touch on what Kaylar said before and what you mentioned, Dougal. I mean, we're dealing with, forget about what the Armenian side says or what the Azerbaijani says. Let's talk about what Turkey and Azerbaijan have actually said. While the ceasefire was being negotiated in Moscow a couple of days ago, the Turkish defense minister was in Italy. And they told him that, it looks like they're on the verge of a ceasefire. And he said there will only be a ceasefire when the Armenians leave Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a sentiment that has been repeated many times by Aliyev in recent days. What does that mean? That means ethnic cleansing. It's a literal threat at ethnic cleansing. It's not saying we want to come and rule over the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. They're saying the ceasefire will end when the Armenians leave Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, the Armenians leave Nagorno-Karabakh, that's ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing, we know, is a very typical beginning to what we know as genocide. So what we expect from the international community is to stand with democracy, not dictatorship. We expect the international community to stand against ethnic cleansing, to stand with indigenous peoples that have continuously inhabited a piece of land. We expect an international community to stand against Islamist jihadism and to stay in favor of Christians that are literally being bullied by an ideology that is just the second coming, or potentially what the neo-Ottomans of today, Erdogan and Aliyev, might be calling the final solution of Armenians.
Can I ask you, Kayla, when My understanding is that one of the issues for Australia in particular in their relationship with Turkey is back to World War I with Gallipoli. And when individual politicians sometimes, my understanding is Australian government's never made a formal statement about the Armenian genocide and hasn't made one about this conflict either, although individual politicians have. But when events like that happen, Turkey says, all right, if you guys make a public declaration as the government, there are no Australians going to Gallipoli this year, or we're not going to be working together on, whatever strategic alliance projects we're working on together. My gut feeling is you don't think that's a particularly good excuse. What would you say to those leaders who are actually in charge and who do have the capability, the Australian leaders, to make formal statements about Armenia's position?
Let me take you to a school playground. A big guy walks around, throws his weight around, and bullies the younger kid, telling that kid that he better do this, otherwise I'm going to beat whatever. This is the behavior of Turkey. And the Australian government is being bullied into taking a stance that is immoral, that is unacceptable in any form, if you were to countenance any moral compass by which we as a society and we as a civilized society need to live by. And the worrying thing is that this keeps repeating itself. A few years ago, last year was it, when Erdogan threatened to send back Australians in coffins, just as they had done, his ancestors had done during Gallipoli. And Gallipoli and the myth that has been constructed in Australia around Gallipoli and the Turkish friendship needs to be really re-examined. It really needs a lot more research than at the moment what we're accepting as this absolute friendship between the Turks and the Australians. But that's another story. The issue currently for us, for me in particular, as a proud Australian, is that my government is unable to speak because it's being gagged by a dictator in Istanbul or in Ankara.
Well, we have seen, I believe, the US take some... they were able in their Congress to condemn the Armenian genocide, I believe. Why do you think... Do you think it's Australian weakness not being able to do it themselves, Hayk?
Because, I mean, if we look at Turkey, we know why Turkey's got Europe in a vice, why they don't speak out. It's because millions... They control the gate of the refugees coming through, and Europe pays them billions of dollars to stop them. But what's going on in Australia? Why, what is this? The US has more freedom in their Congress than we do in our democracy.
Freedom.
They do. They do. I mean, the reality is. So let's play this out for a moment with the genocide. You've got. You mentioned Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison, 2011, stood up and not just spoke about the Armenian genocide by name. He actually called on Australia to recognise the Armenian genocide. He became Prime Minister, and then he released a statement that basically said that, we sympathise with the Armenians on this day of commemoration without using the G word. When he was confronted about this in the lead up to the last election by a journalist, he responded to the journalist to say, well, we have been working very hard to make that trip a possibility about Gallipoli. So when asked about the genocide, he literally, with his own words, said it has to do with Gallipoli. Now, my understanding from the conversations that I have had, it's not simply about stopping Gallipoli from going ahead or closing Gallipoli down for renovations. It's also potential threats that happen at the time of Gallipoli, and Turkey saying that they might not actually be able to protect the Australians that go and complete their pilgrimage. This is literally holding the graves of our Anzac soldiers as hostages in negotiating a human rights issue with Australia. That is the literal thing that's going on. Now, The difference between the Congress and the Parliament of Australia, it's not very different when you look at the individuals and the overall will of the Parliament. You know, we have, because obviously the Greeks and the Assyrians were also impacted by the Armenian genocide. They lost around 1 million of their own minority Christian citizens of the Ottoman Empire back then. Together we formed the Joint Justice Initiative this year, and we have been collecting signatures of parliamentarians to see how many of them would be willing to put their name and signature onto a document that says we want Australia to recognise the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocides. That is already about a third of Parliament that has signed that. The amount that have actually spoken since 1988, when Hansard started taking records, is 78 speeches, but individuals making speeches. When you count all the speeches using the words Armenian genocide, calling for recognition, it's well over 100. Our allies are some of the names that, you know, will roll off any Australian sort of political junkie's tongue. These people are our allies. We've got ministers like Sukkar and Fletcher. We've got shadow ministers like, you know, Keneally and Fitzgibbon. We've got people from the left like the Greens, for example, who have a party position to recognise the genocide. And when Corey Bernardi was there, his Conservatives had a position to recognise the Armenian genocide. You had everyone from Lionhelm to One Nation. You have everyone in between in terms of individuals. The issue is that there is a gag order. Otherwise, if you leave it up to the will of the Parliament will recognise the Armenian genocide. The gag order
Is it the deep state?
Well, no, I wouldn't want to. Look, I'll leave the theorising to others. The facts that I deal with on a day-to-day basis in representing our community is that the Parliament, who are elected by all of us, have a different opinion on this thing than the administration, because the administration is guided by the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is the real hold on this issue, and turning the bureaucracy is apparently is more difficult than turning a Mack truck. So there needs to be political pressure applied. We have a lot of great allies in trying to make that happen. However, it will take the will of people to say this is what it is. And on this issue, the Artsakh issue, Australia is not saying nothing on it. What they're saying is effectively nothing. They're saying that we encourage both sides to put their weapons down and return to the negotiating table. Like 3 million Christians, you know, Armenia and Artsakh combined, have decided one morning to pick a fight with 100 million Turks, right, between Turkey and Azerbaijan, with nowhere near the military build-up of their opponents, right? And the media, I mean, the idea that they constantly say, oh, you know, both sides are blaming each other. Yes, but bloody go find the truth. You know, Amnesty has just reported that a cluster bomb was let off in the Armenian capital of Stepanakert, right? Stepanakert is where the only independent record of a cluster bomb has been registered. It's an illegal weapon to use. Did the Armenians bomb their own capital? No. You don't need to say, but the Azeris deny it.
I must object, mate. We've got the Azerbaijani dictator stating that the Armenians are the ones bombing their own churches and using cluster bombs on their own people. Yeah. So that they can blame the Azerbaijanis. That was just an aside. Sorry, Hayk.
No, I mean, this is what we're dealing with, and I think the frustration that we have as a community is because we just sort of expect more from people that are just sort of exert the values that Australia does, you know, and I don't think it's much to ask.
So let me get this straight. We're going to talk very plainly now. The position Australia's taken is that when you're in government, you will not take the Armenian side on this, because it seems like you're getting everyone that's not in government to sign on to this, onto this, basically.
The executive branch of government, because a lot of government MPs are on our side.
And the reason they're giving is that they don't want to endanger dead Australians that died in the Gallipoli War. Those families visiting, those Australians doing the pilgrimage over to Turkey, they don't want to endanger those lives. So what we've done, I respect the Anzacs, I respect the sacrifice they've made. We are elevating their sacrifice to a possible genocide happening today to living people.
That's speaking plainly.
And in terms of the actions of Silent Scott on this, can we trust him anymore? I mean, the fact that I'll give credit where credit's due, but it sounds like he's flip-flopped on this because he's in government now, and now he's not walking the walk. What if you could give a message to Scott Morrison directly? What would you say to him?
Well, our message to Scott Morrison is clear. We expect more. We know we're not asking him to say something that he hasn't said before. We're not trying to put words in his mouth. We are saying that whatever words you have spoken in the past, continue to speak those words. Walk the walk that you have walked. Don't let anybody, especially a foreign dictatorship, stop you from saying what you know is right, what you have said is right. The only thing I will add on this issue is foreign interference is a major issue in Australian politics. You guys know that and I do. But China is not the only game in town. What is this? I mean, this whole focus on China, not that it shouldn't be. Absolutely China should be a focus. But all of our laws are written with China in mind. All of the legislation that is implemented is with China in mind. Therefore, all of these Islamist dictatorships that have their tentacles into Australia are not being given the attention that these laws deserve. And we have politicians, good people, because Scott Morrison is a good person, right, being gagged when I'm sure he doesn't want to be gagged.
Mm. Well, you mentioned applying political pressure to the bureaucracies before. I understand there may or may not be a protest in Sydney in a few weeks' time, but we have seen someone was telling me big protests in America recently with tens or potentially hundreds of thousands of people. But, we don't hear about it. I mean, I checked CNN this morning and it was another trans story. It was a story about trans someone, but nothing about the Armenian genocide or Hunter Biden for that matter. Probably the two big stories of the day. Can you tell us about the political pressure that's being applied or needs to be applied, and then tell us why you think there might not be the media coverage that it deserves?
I'll let you.
Yeah, look, I think, again, it's a combination of things, right? Of course, the media, majority of them are businesses, and they need to serve news that they believe will be most consumed, right? And that's their prerogative. However, they also have a responsibility as the fourth estate in Australia to hold everybody to account, right? Otherwise, what is the point of the democracy that we live in? In terms of why they do what they do, some of it is overt corruption. Some of it is media having other interests, and I think some of it is resources, right? Depleted resources. I think if you put all of these together, you'll find the reason of why it's happening. But the reason I said corruption is because the BBC the other day had a headline that said the church that was bombed in Shushis, what was it, 300, when was that church goes back?
1780.
Yeah, so 18th century church, right? It was bombed, and then when the journalists went in, including Armenian journalists, Russian journalists, others, to inspect the damage, a second hit was made on the church, and injured one of the journalists, one of the Russian journalists that was in there. Now, BBC reported this with the headline saying Armenia accuses Azerbaijan of bombing a church, right? Just like, so what is the alternative consideration in that headline? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you're not wanting to take a stance there, just in your headline, you must be considering that something else might have happened, right? Is it the aliens or is it the Armenians, right? So the reason I brought up BBC is because the Azerbaijani laundromat is an investigation by the same guys that brought you the Panama Papers, right? And their investigations looked into, uncovered, I should say, $3.2 billion in paid bribes by the Azerbaijani dictatorship to Western politicians, businesses, and media entities. The majority of that money, and that's just 2 years of work between 2012 and 14, before the Azerbaijani embassy was founded here. So in those 2 years, a lot of money was spent, particularly in the UK. $200,000 of that money is actually sitting in Australian accounts. We'll find out where that is through some investigation that we're trying to do. But these sorts of corruption is something that can't be overlooked. But we're also finding copy-paste journalism take over from anything else. You know, you're seeing these BBCs and Reuters being lazy, under-resourced or corrupt. They're putting stories out, and then you've got the Aussie media. This isn't really in our country. It's not even in our sort of region. So we'll just copy-paste from these guys that we usually do it, and that'll be sweet. So that's the other thing. But the example that I'm going to bring up of an actual Australian journalist that I had this same discussion with 2 days ago, it blew my mind, right? He was genuinely trying to cover the story, right? And he said, look, I complained that why do you keep saying the Armenian side said this and the Azerbaijani side said this? Because we want to be balanced. I said, but, you know, if Goebbels, you know, he was a great propagandist, you know, delivered stories about the Jewish Holocaust, okay? And Albert Einstein, who was forced to flee Germany at the time, said, hang on a sec, but they're literally slaughtering us, gassing us, killing us. Were you going to say, hang on a sec, to make this a balanced story, I better go see what Goebbels has to say about this, right? That's who we're dealing with. Aliyev, he took over from his dad. Most Azerbaijanis, right, who are 30 and under, 40 and under, have only had an Aliyev as a president. He literally is a real-life house of cards. His wife is his vice president. Today, not tomorrow. He changed the age, the minimum age of president, from 30 to 18 because that's the age of his son in case something happens to him. You know, he called the results of an election before his citizens had voted. We're dealing with this. Why can't this be part of the media narrative, I said? You know, these are facts. So at least people know one side is a dictatorship and the other side is a democracy.
Well, they seem to have no problem doing that with perceived dictators like Donald Trump. They have no trouble trashing that guy who is actually democratically elected. But I digress. But can you talk about the protests that have been happening in America? I haven't been able to have a look and research them, but it seems like they're a big deal.
I haven't seen a thing on it. And I've got my finger on the pulse over there. I haven't seen a thing. So 4 million Armenians over there?
It's closer to 1.5, but a lot of them are in California.
Right.
And the biggest protest, the one that you're probably referring to, which received very large coverage in the sort of West Coast media in particular, but it was also covered by the Times and other places. It's one of the largest non-civil rights protests ever. 150,000 down Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles downtown. They marched and it was very peaceful and all the rest of it, but it was unbelievable footage to see it. We will have a demonstration on Saturday, and we've called it next Saturday, not tomorrow. So just so we're clear. So
it'll be the
24th.
Saturday coming up.
Yeah.
For those people watching.
Yeah, Saturday the 24th. And we've called it March for Armenians, and it will be in the city. We'll reveal the route later on, but we believe it will be very large because it's not just for Armenians, it's anyone that wants to march for Armenians. It's anyone that wants to end the silence of the Australian government, end the silence of the media, and also end the cycle of dictatorships and genocide.
Mm. Well, potentially to finish off, unless Joel has any other questions, I was being told an interesting story about the Anzacs in Armenia during the First World War, and considering our relationship with Turkey and Armenia has the Anzacs and their graves as a great consideration, but potentially the Anzac and Armenian story remains untold for most Australians. Would you like to describe how the Anzacs were able to help Armenia during the genocide?
That's what I was alluding to when I was talking about the Anzac myth, because it seems that there was nothing apart from the Anzacs and the Turkish dictatorship at the time of Kemal Atatürk being absolutely friendly. Even the quote we see everywhere in Australia has been proven to be false. It was never quoted by Atatürk. It just is a made-up PR thing that has appeared in the 1930s. The Anzacs records show that the Anzacs actually recorded the Armenian genocide while they were in Turkey as prisoners of war, or even while they were fighting the Turks, the Ottomans at the time. Professor Peter Stanley and our own Viken Papkanian have done, and that's the book, have done incredible research, and they've come up with this book, Armenia, Australia and the Great War. It is a book that really reveals the relationship between the Anzacs and the victims of the Armenian genocide, or the survivors of the Armenian genocide. Hayk can elaborate a bit more on it, but there are stories in here that no one for the past 105 years has ever spoken about. But the Anzacs, to their credit, a lot of our soldiers, our very brave Anzac soldiers, took time to actually record what was happening at the time. Some of them even did unimaginable feats of bravery to save a huge number of Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrian refugees at the time. It is a story worth reading. It's a story worth listening to, and I would say every Australian should read this book, because you will be surprised as to what is contained in there.
To elaborate on that, the fact that they did record it, and obviously they saved a lot of lives physically, but the fact that they recorded and sent these messages back home, it was reported by over 30,000 press articles that we found in Australia. While the word genocide didn't exist, it was talking about Armenians being massacred, Armenians butchered.
Well, to pause on, I want you to continue that in 1 second, but the guy, I think his name is Raphael Lemkin, who's the guy who came up with the word genocide, was using it in reference to Armenia in the first place.
And the Holocaust, that's right. So he actually, it's a famous interview where they said, why did you come up with a new word and author the Genocide Convention, the UN Genocide Convention? He said, well, it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians, and then it happened to the Jews, and there is no crime to satisfy mass murder, right? Based on race or sect or religion or whatever it might be. So while the word genocide wasn't around when the Anzacs were in Gallipoli, they did report very clearly what was going on. The press reported it, and it started what is the first major international humanitarian relief effort by Australia. So the equivalent of $1 million of wool, milk, dollars, and all of these supplies were gathered in local communities in all states across Australia, and they were shipped to Armenia through a government-sanctioned and government-provided ship. And basically, a lot of Armenians were saved because of this. I mean, one of the guys in the office here, Areg, his great-grandfather is in a very famous photograph where the Australians, Anglican Australians, they ran an orphanage in Lebanon for those Armenians who survived the death marches. And, many of our community, including Areg's great-grandfather, are actually featured in that famous picture with the Reverend Cresswell of Adelaide, out of all people, with the Australian flag and the Armenian flag hanging, and looking after thousands of orphans in that orphanage. This was called the Australasian Orphanage. So the gag order that we talked about before in Australia, this foreign gag order, is not just stopping Australia from recognising the Armenian genocide, the history of mine and Kaylar's origins, it's also preventing Australia from recognising this piece of Australian history. And I think that needs to be addressed.
One last question from me, but before we get there, I just want to tell you guys a quick story. Bad things happen. We all know it. And if we don't see it, then we're just going to turn a blind eye, and we're going to forget about history. You referenced a lot of the same jihadis from Syria going there. Well, I can testify, and I don't even think I've told you this, Dougal. My dad's cousin, my dad passed away a couple of weeks ago. My dad's cousin, he had a son, and he fought in the Syrian army. And the Syrian army at the time was widely viewed as protecting Christians because the government was an Alawi government, and they tend to protect the Christians. And then Syria started to get destabilized. ISIS fighters, jihadist fighters, started pouring in, mercenaries, being funded by outside sources we all know about. And this poor cousin of my dad's, he found out about his son's death because he was being beheaded and he saw it on TV. And he was a Christian. Because that's how they do it. They say, "You Christian?" And that's it. He's gone.
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, look, to be honest, the Guardian, even a BBC report, and others have now all corroborated that there are mercenaries, up to 4,000 Islamist jihadist mercenaries, and in the interviews with some of those mercenaries, one of them basically said that we're being paid $1,500 a month by Turkey, and there is the promise for Christian blood, Allahu Akbar, and that's that. So that's what this is for those people. To be honest, any mercenary is dangerous, but we know that the largest destabilizing force in the Middle East at the moment is Turkey. Yeah. And that largest destabilizing force now has sent some of the most vicious mercenaries the world has ever seen to Armenia's doorstep, and it's keeping our community and us up at night.
Well, let's emphasize the point that we're talking about Islamists here, and in a week or so, guys, on the Saturday coming up when this is released, we hope to see the Muslim community in Australia out there with us, rallying, because we can all rally around this, You don't have to be Muslim, Christian, or Jew to do this. We're all on the same page. We don't want to see needless bloodshed. That's why we came to Australia, right?
Yeah. Look, we have a phenomenal relationship with all communities. We actually pride ourselves on that reputation. We never segment people based on their faith or religion because we've seen what that does to us. We've also seen how people of the Muslim faith saved so many Armenians during the genocide. If there was such a thing as the Armenian version of what the Jews had in Schindler, that person would have also been a Muslim. We acknowledge all of that. And we also think in the diaspora as a whole, the majority of people are decent. And we have good relationships with the Arab Council, the Lebanese Muslim Association, other people. And we are inviting everybody to rally with us because what we're rallying against is the form of Islamist jihadism that is a discredit to Islam. And I think that it's very important that we distinguish that, and we invite everybody who is against that, is against Turkey's weaponization of that, and Azerbaijan's, to come and help us stop Australia being silent on that.
Absolutely.
Well, fantastic. I will put. You like to say one more thing?
Please.
Go for it.
Yeah.
You've got the mic.
Yeah. Okay. I'd just like to follow on from what Hayk was saying about the silence. My people, our people in Artsakh, have the view that there's an impending genocide awaiting them. Should this continue for a lot longer, because as we said, the forces are unmatched, incredibly unmatched, but we will fight to hold on to our lands. What we expect, or the people of Artsakh wish and expect from international communities, and including Australia, is to recognize the Republic of Artsakh. With the recognition of the Republic of Artsakh as a free, independent, democratic state, as part of the family of nations of the world, will provide that protection that these people need to avoid or prevent being subjected to yet another genocide like the one we saw in 1915. We Armenians say never again, and this time again we are saying never again. So I call on the Australian government, I call on the Australian people, we call on the Australian people, our Australian brothers and sisters, to stand up and make their voices heard. Because unless that is done, we may end up with, we won't allow it to happen, but the possibility exists that we will have another genocide.
Okay. Well, we will put a link to that protest in the description and in the captions. We will link the book Armenia, Australia and the Great War. We'll direct people to the offer to the Armenian National Committee website, social medias. Is there anywhere else you would like to direct people?
They can also visit my office's webpage, preferably our Twitter and our Facebook page. It's the Artsakh office in Australia. We, along with the Armenian National Committee, are constantly updating the communities in Australia and our own community about current developments. So it's a good source for them to see what is exactly going on in that part of the world.
I would like to thank you guys for bringing light to this issue. It's been a good discussion. It's been deep. So I think it's really important that you're bringing light to these things, and I wish you guys success in everything that you need to do.
Thank you. We appreciate it. We'll very quickly we'll be up there real soon. We think we might be providing some of the best journalism in the country. So very soon, very shortly, we can give light to even more of the issues. Hopefully.
Again, I'd like to join Hayk and thank you both very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for doing it. I can imagine you guys are under a lot of stress, and so I appreciate you guys taking the time. So, Hayk, Kayserian and Kaylar Michaelian, thank you very much. This has been our discussion of Artsakh. Make sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends. This is probably the most important interview we've done to date. So that's it from me. Thank you, Joel Jammal. Pleasure as always.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, and share it. Otherwise, we'll go nowhere. It'll get a few hundred views. Make sure you share it. That's what really gets it. Don't like it, share it.
I'm Dougal Cameron. That's it. See you next time.